The air over Betio was thick with smoke, the scent of burning gunpowder clinging to the battlefield. The last echoes of Japanese resistance had faded, their once mighty artillery now silent beneath the weight of relentless American firepower. The island, once an impenetrable fortress, now trembled under the tread of U.S. Marines' Boondockers, marking the hard-fought victory. But the battle was far from over. Though the last big gun had fallen quiet, remnants of an enemy willing to fight to the death still lurked in the rubble. As the Marines secured their foothold, the cost of taking Betio became clear, and the reality of war set in deeper than ever before. The battle had raged for days, every inch of the island contested in a storm of fire and steel. Betio had been transformed from a fortified Japanese stronghold into a wasteland of shattered bunkers, burned-out pillboxes, and craters deep enough to swallow men whole. The air was thick with smoke, the sky darkened by the haze of spent gunpowder and smoldering debris. The last of the Japanese big guns had been silenced, its iron throat no longer roaring death across the battlefield. It had stood defiant until the very end, its operators choosing destruction over surrender, its final shots ripping through the American lines before a well-placed shell from offshore naval artillery turned it into twisted wreckage. The Marines had pressed forward through the chaos, rifles at the ready, knowing that even with its fall, the fight was far from over. The enemy had not gone quietly. In the final moments before their defenses collapsed, they had fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that no reinforcements were coming. Their commanders had given the order: fight to the last man, to the last bullet. They obeyed without hesitation. Grenades rained from hidden bunkers. Bursts of machine gun fire cut through advancing squads, and when ammunition ran out, they resorted to bayonets and blades, dragging the battle into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Marines moved methodically, clearing each trench, each shattered structure, knowing that even one survivor could mean sudden death. The Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying this island, turning it into a fortress meant to withstand anything the Americans could throw at it. But in the end, even the strongest defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. A squad pushed forward through the rubble, rifles raised, scanning every pile of twisted metal for movement. A faint sound, shuffling, breathing, sent a chill through the lead Marine's spine. He signaled his men to halt. A bunker, partially collapsed, its entrance buried beneath fallen concrete, still held life inside. The Marines knew what to expect. A wounded enemy, unwilling to surrender, waiting for the chance to take one more life before his own was ended. The squad leader called out in broken Japanese, offering a chance to lay down arms. No response. A grenade was primed, tossed into the opening. A muffled explosion. Silence. The Marines moved on. The island was littered with reminders of the cost. Wrecked landing craft, torn apart by pre-sighted artillery. Helmets without owners. Rifles lying abandoned in the sand, their barrels coated in blood and dirt. There was no glory in what they had done, only necessity. They had come here not to conquer, but to claim a foothold in a war that would stretch far beyond this island. Among the ruins, scattered bodies of the enemy lay where they had fallen, some still gripping their weapons in death. The Japanese had refused surrender at every turn, choosing instead to perish with their honor intact. The few prisoners that had been taken were dazed, barely able to process that they had survived when so many of their comrades had not. But there was little time to process victory. Orders came quickly. The battle was won, but the island had to be secured. Every last inch swept for survivors, every tunnel searched, every strongpoint confirmed as cleared. The war would not allow them to pause, not even for a moment. A Marine wiped the sweat and dirt from his face, staring down at his boots pressed into the scorched earth. The silence left in the wake of battle was unsettling, as if the island itself still carried the echoes of gunfire. The fight had been harder than expected, the enemy more ruthless than imagined, but Betio now belonged to them. The final stand had been broken. The guns had fallen quiet, but as the Marines pressed forward, securing their hard-fought ground, they knew this was only the beginning. The battle had been won, but Betio still held dangers beneath its shattered surface. The last of the heavy artillery had fallen silent, Yet the Marines knew the fight wasn't truly over. The enemy had prepared for this moment, carving tunnels deep into the earth, burrowing beneath the ruins of their own defenses. They had not surrendered in the open, and they would not do so now. The island, though taken, was far from secure. The first sign of lingering resistance came as the Marines moved deeper into the wreckage. A sudden burst of gunfire cracked through the air, sending them diving for cover behind the remains of a collapsed bunker. A lone rifleman, hidden among the rubble, had waited in silence for the perfect moment to strike. Before he could fire again, return shots found their mark, and the island grew quiet once more. But it was a warning. This was not yet over. They moved cautiously, advancing in tight formations, covering every angle. The tunnels were the greatest threat now. Dug with precision, they provided hidden routes for those still willing to fight. A man could disappear into the darkness beneath the ground, only to emerge behind friendly lines, striking with deadly accuracy before vanishing once more. The Marines had seen it before on other islands, and they knew what had to be done. A flamethrower team was called forward. The entrances to these underground pathways were located one by one, each a dark mouth leading into the unknown. No words were exchanged as the thick streams of fire poured into the openings, the heat roaring through the confined spaces. Smoke billowed upward, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning earth and flesh. No one emerged. The tunnels had been turned into tombs. Pockets of resistance remained scattered across the battlefield. Some Japanese soldiers had buried themselves beneath fallen structures, waiting for nightfall to make a final, desperate attack. Others clutched their rifles with shaking hands, knowing their fate was sealed but refusing to submit. The Marines moved carefully, sweeping the area, ensuring that the battle did not have a second life, waiting to strike from the shadows. Each step taken was met with the weight of what had transpired. The bodies of fallen comrades lay beside those of the enemy, all of them now part of the same brutal landscape. Medics moved among the wounded, doing what they could for the men who had survived the assault. Some wounds were physical, others buried deeper. No one left this island unchanged. As the day stretched on, the realization settled in. Betio belonged to them now. The blood that had soaked the sands had paid for it, and the Marines had delivered what was asked of them. Yet, as they looked across the wreckage, there was no celebration, no cheers of triumph, only exhaustion. Only the weight of another battle behind them, and the knowledge that many more lay ahead. The sounds of war had faded, replaced by the distant crash of waves and the rustling wind moving through the ruined palm trees. The island, once a fortress, had been reduced to smoldering rubble. The Japanese defenders had fought to the last, fulfilling the orders given to them. Their war was over, though they had chosen to end it in defiance rather than surrender. The Marines stood among the ruins, their boots pressing into the dirt, their rifles still at the ready. The battle had taken its toll, but they had endured. Betio was theirs. But even in victory, they knew this was only one step in a long and bloody journey across the Pacific. There would be more islands, more resistance, more moments where survival seemed impossible. For now, they had secured this piece of land, paid for with sacrifice and unwavering determination. The last defenders had fallen, the tunnels had been sealed, and the echoes of war had finally begun to fade. The Marines pressed forward, not to fight, but to claim what they had won, knowing that soon another battle would call them to fight once more. The aftermath of battle lingered in the air, thick with the scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The Marines moved across the ruined landscape, their boots pressing into the sand, now stained with the price of victory. They had taken Betio, but the cost was clear in the silent forms of those who had fought beside them, in the shattered remains of what had once been an impenetrable fortress. The wounded lay in makeshift triage zones, medics working frantically to save those who could still be helped. Some men whispered quiet prayers, others stared blankly at the sky, lost in the weight of what they had survived. The battle had pushed them beyond exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The dead had to be buried, the equipment salvaged, and the remaining defenses dismantled to ensure no last threats remained. Marines gathered what little supplies could still be used, ammunition from fallen enemies, weapons stripped from broken hands, canteens emptied and refilled. The island had been burned and battered beyond recognition, palm trees splintered by gunfire, concrete bunkers blasted into craters of dust and stone. In the distance, the wreckage of landing craft still bobbed in the water, some half-sunken, others shattered on the reefs. Each one was a reminder of how close the battle had come to disaster. Beyond the ruins, small pockets of enemy holdouts continued their final defiance. From caves and trenches, occasional gunfire still cracked through the air, a desperate attempt to fight on even when there was nothing left to fight for. The Marines moved with caution, advancing through the wreckage with rifles raised. A shot rang out. A Marine stumbled, his brothers returning fire in an instant. The shooter had been waiting, hidden beneath the collapsed bunker, unwilling to surrender even now. It was over in seconds. Another enemy gone, but not without a price. Flamethrowers cleared the last of the resistance. The tunnels, beneath the ground now silent graves. No orders had been given to take prisoners. None had offered themselves up. The enemy had fought to the last, their loyalty to the Emperor stronger than any fear of death. The few who had been captured remained quiet, staring at the ruins around them, knowing that their war had come to an end. As the sun dipped lower, the island took on an eerie stillness. The constant roar of artillery had faded, leaving behind only the rhythmic crash of the waves. Marines stood on the blackened sand, some lighting cigarettes with shaky hands, others staring at the wreckage, lost in their own thoughts. They had trained for this, had known the brutality that awaited them, yet none could have predicted the sheer hell they had endured. A squad leader knelt beside a fallen comrade, wiping dirt from the name stenciled onto his uniform. He had fought beside him only hours ago, charging through fire, pressing forward despite the impossible odds. Now there was nothing left but a body and the memories of the fight they had shared. The beach, once an unapproachable wall of enemy fire, now stood open, the waters calm, the sky streaked with the colors of a setting sun. The battle was over, but it was not a moment of celebration. There was no cheering, no shouts of triumph, only the understanding that war did not grant moments of relief, only brief pauses before the next fight began. Marines gathered in groups, some writing letters home, others silently tending to their weapons. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air. They had taken this island, secured it for the next step in the war. But at what cost? The enemy had fought with unrelenting determination, refusing to surrender even in the face of certain defeat. What lay ahead would only be worse. The island was theirs, but they knew they could not stay. Orders would come soon, another battle waiting for them beyond the horizon. They had won the fight, but the war was far from over. The night settled over Betio, the fire still smoldering, the island scarred by the violence of the past days. Marines stood guard, watching the darkness, knowing that even in victory, there was no true safety. They had silenced the last enemy gun, but the echoes of war would never truly fade. The night passed with an eerie stillness, the island no longer echoing with gunfire. Yet the tension remained thick. The Marines had secured Betio, but the weight of their victory settled heavily on their shoulders. Every step forward had been bought with blood, and now, as they moved through the ruins, the true cost of the battle became impossible to ignore. The bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe, lay scattered across the battlefield, their lifeless forms blending into the charred remains of what had once been a fortress. The ground, torn apart by artillery and explosions, had been transformed into an unrecognizable wasteland. The air was still thick with the stench of death, the mingling sense of salt, smoke, and decay settling into the very earth. Marines worked in solemn silence, retrieving their dead and preparing them for burial. There was no ceremony, no time for long farewells, only a brief moment to acknowledge those who had fought and fallen before moving on to the next task. The enemy, too, had to be dealt with. Their bodies, many of them clutching weapons even in death, were gathered into makeshift graves. Some Marines turned their eyes away as they worked, others stared blankly, their expressions hardened by all they had endured. The island had been won, but the Marines knew their fight was far from over. They had seen the lengths to which the enemy would go to defend their land, had fought through a resistance that refused to break even in the face of overwhelming firepower. This was just the beginning. Each island ahead would be another Betio, another battlefield where survival was never guaranteed. Orders came down to establish a secure perimeter, to ensure no lingering threats remained. Patrols moved through the ruins, sweeping the last standing structures, stepping carefully through rubble-strewn paths where the enemy could still be hiding. Though the major resistance had been crushed, caution was their greatest ally now. A single enemy soldier left unchecked could take another life, another brother in arms lost in a war that had already claimed too many. As the sun rose, casting its golden light over the wreckage, the sight of the American flag fluttering in the breeze signaled the island's fate. The Marines had done what they came to do. Betio belonged to them now, its strategic value secured for the next stage of the Pacific campaign. But standing among the destruction, looking at what was left, the idea of victory felt hollow. Marines sat on the edges of craters, their rifles resting across their laps, their eyes distant. Some wrote letters home, struggling to find the words to describe what they had seen. Others stared out at the waves, where the remnants of their landing crafts still bobbed in the surf, half-sunken testaments to the price they had paid to set foot on this island. The high-ranking officers gathered for their debriefing, discussing the lessons learned from the battle, the mistakes made, the realities of what awaited them in the coming months. They had underestimated the enemy's resolve, the strength of their fortifications, the willingness to fight to the last breath. Those mistakes would not be made again. The next objective was already being planned. There would be no long rest, no time to dwell on the past. The war did not pause for grief, nor did it allow for hesitation. The Marines who had survived Betio would soon be moving forward, taking what they had learned and carrying it into the next battle, the next island, the next storm of fire and steel. Yet, for now, they remained on the ground they had fought so hard to claim, walking through the silence that followed war, knowing that soon they would be stepping onto another battlefield, where more sacrifices would be demanded, and more names would be left behind. As the evening fell once again, the last fires burned low, and the sounds of hammers and shovels replaced the echoes of gunfire. A base would be built here, a staging ground for the coming battles, a foothold in a war that stretched across the vast Pacific. The island had been taken, the last enemy guns silenced, but the war had only just begun. The Marines laced up their boots, adjusted their gear, and prepared for what lay ahead. Betio was behind them, but their journey was far from over. The enemy still held the islands beyond, still waited for them in the jungles, in the hills, in the fortresses yet to be stormed. The Pacific stretched before them, vast and unyielding, a battleground that would demand more than they had already given. But they would go forward, because that was what they had been sent to do. The war would not wait, and neither would they. The island had fallen, but the weight of what had happened would never leave those who had fought there. The echoes of war still lingered in the air, the smell of burnt wood and gunpowder mixing with the salty breeze. The sand, once untouched and golden, was now scarred with the footprints of those who had survived and the blood of those who had not. The battle was over, but its memory would remain long after the last Marine left the island. The men moved through the wreckage, some in silence, others exchanging quiet words that carried little beyond the shattered landscape. The final fires had burned out, leaving behind only smoldering remains of the once mighty Japanese defenses. Pillboxes that had withstood endless barges were now hollowed-out shells. Machine gun nests that had rained down death were abandoned, their barrels twisted and useless. The jungle, torn apart by artillery and flamethrowers, stood eerily quiet, stripped of its natural cover. Some of the Marines stood along the shore, watching the waves wash over the remnants of landing craft that had never made it past the reef. The ocean, indifferent to the battle that had raged, carried away fragments of broken steel and splintered wood. Those who had fallen on the beach had been recovered, but the sea had taken some, dragging them into its depths, leaving nothing but ripples where they had once stood. The wounded had been tended to, the dead accounted for, but the real wounds of war could not be seen. Faces that had once carried confidence and determination now bore the weight of what had been endured. Hands that had once gripped rifles with steady resolve now trembled when unoccupied. War changed men, and those who had fought on Betio knew they would never be the same. In the distance, engineers worked to establish what would soon be a forward base. Runways would be built, supply depots set up, and command posts established. The island would serve as a crucial point in the march across the Pacific, but to those who had fought for it, it was more than just a strategic victory. It was a place where brothers had fought and died, where courage had been tested in its rawest form, and where survival had often come down to luck as much as skill. A Marine sat on a makeshift crate, staring at the ground, his helmet resting beside him. His rifle, still caked with dirt and grime, lay across his knees. He had stopped counting how many times he had pulled the trigger, stopped remembering each time he had heard the sharp crack of return fire. It was over, but the battle played on in his mind, every movement, every gunshot, every moment of fear and fury replaying like a film he could not stop watching. Another Marine, younger and less hardened by time, sat beside him. He didn't say anything at first, just looked out at the ruined landscape, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the scratches on his dog tags. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think it gets easier?" The older Marine didn't answer right away. He had asked the same question once, long ago, before this island, before this war had stripped him of the illusions of battle. He wanted to lie, to say that it did, that with each fight it became less of a burden, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "No," he finally said, "but you get used to it." The younger Marine nodded, though it was clear he didn't yet understand. He would in time, as the last patrols moved across the island, confirming that no enemy remained. The final reports were written. The battle for Betio was officially over. The flag had been raised, the ground secured, and the island taken. Soon, transports would arrive to move the surviving men to their next destination. Some would leave by ship, some would stay to build what would come next, but all would carry with them the memories of what had happened here. In the coming weeks, new forces would arrive, stepping onto the same blood-stained beaches, walking through the same ruins. But for them, Betio would not hold the same weight. They would see a base, a place of operations, not the battlefield it had once been. Only those who had fought here would understand, would remember the cost. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the last of the Marines stood along the shoreline, staring out at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, another island waited, another battle yet to be fought. The war was not over. The fight was not finished. But tonight, for the first time in days, the guns were silent. The wind carried the sound of distant waves crashing against the shore, a rhythm that had existed long before the war and would continue long after. The ocean did not care for victories or losses, for heroes or fallen soldiers. It simply moved as it always had, indifferent to the suffering of men. The Marines gathered their gear, shouldered their rifles, and walked away from the battlefield. Some glanced back one last time, etching the sight into their minds, knowing they would never forget it. Others kept their eyes forward, focused on what lay ahead, knowing that this was just another step in a war that had no easy end. Betio had been taken. The last of the enemy had fallen. The war would go on. But for now, the island was theirs.